glass is a strange medium to work with.
It's like a world on the end of a blowing arrow. It's beautiful.
It looks like if you're looking into a secret world and you're seeing a background, you know, like a treasure.
Glass has been part of our world for some 6,000 years. The Romans used it, making the first windows. Fragments of panes some 2 centimeters thick have been found in the ruins of Pompeii. The first bottles appeared around 1300, when glass workers had the added stress that if they revealed any of their special formulas, they might pay for the indiscretion with their lives. In the 16th century, the material still had the same elevated status. Window panes were so expensive that when the lord of the chateau was away, servants used to take them out and put them in storage in case they got broken. Through all the years, the fascination which this unique sum has continued. Working and shaping it still carries a mystique that links today's glassmakers with those of 16th century Venice or 19th century France. But this is Scotland, on the edge of the 21st century. And these are the makers of Caithness glass. Despite the fact that glass is manufactured from a variety of raw ingredients, it's seen as a pure natural substance, far removed from the qualities of the synthetic materials that try to emulate it. Right from the beginnings, in their first factory in Glass, enhanced that close natural connection by working to give their products a look which was characteristic of the very special countryside which surrounded them. This is the Wick factory today, but the story began factory in 1961. The original designs were conceived along the same lines as the well-established Scandinavian styles, but by creating vases and bowls touched with the colours of heather, peat and lochs, the unique identity of Caithness glass was quickly assured. Innovative impulse continued through the 60s, producing departures from traditional glass designs. The range gradually expanded, and the markets kept on responding to the initiatives with enthusiasm. In 1968, the company's preeminence was acknowledged in the granting of a royal warrant to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Caithness glass was obviously by now a major player in the whole area of glassmaking. It was time to set up its own engraving studio. It was a move that led to some rather surprising and certainly unforeseen developments.
I joined the company to start an engraving department. Unknown to me at that time, they had the only paperweight maker really in the UK, who was a Spanish chap called Paul Isart, who was employed by the company as training officer. And it just so happened on a Sunday, he made paperweights, beautiful paperweights, and they all went to the US. And the style of weight he did was very traditional. In other words, it was millefiori canes and possibly an animal, a flower, a bird. And as he was the master recognized in that field, I thought, I'm not going to attempt this, but there's other things obviously we can do. And nobody else is doing it. Luckily, it was the space age, Sputniks, rockets to the moon, all this good stuff. So I thought, let's try and create something with a space theme. I didn't know how to do it. Hadn't a clue.
He may not have had a clue, but nonetheless, he designed the first ever set of Caithness paperweights, the planets. There were no precedents. It was an entirely new concept. So where did the designs come from?
Everybody, believe it or not, though they don't really realise it, knows that Saturn is the planet with the rings round about it. So that's an instantly obvious one. Mars, music, as well as astronomy, god of war, angry, fiery, easy one to do. Venus was a bit more difficult, so I did a sort of entwining form, shall we say. In the old days, every glassmaker had everybody believing that a bubble in a piece of glass was a spot of mercury. So obviously the one for Mercury was just a lovely big sphere which looked like a blob of mercury over an interesting planetary ground. We launched the product and we had one guy who could make them. It was crazy, but it worked.
It certainly did. At the time, no one knew whether or not there was even a market for paperweights. But in just 1 year, the limited edition of 500 sets sold out, 400 in the USA and the remaining 100 in the UK. The instincts of Colin Terrace and his Caithness colleagues had been right. In the same year, 1969, a new factory was opened in Oban on the west coast. It was a response to the continuing demand for the company's products, and originally it produced artware, especially the type known as Obanware, with its distinctive coloured stripes floating inside the glass. A year later, another avenue was opened with the launching of Caithness jewellery, which began producing miniature paperweights set in hallmarked silver. By 1974, the company was 13 years old and had been producing paperweights for only 5 years. But interest in their designs was now worldwide. 2 factories were no longer enough to meet the market's needs, and in 1979, the company expanded further, opening another factory, this time in Perth. Every decade has continued to add to the momentum established in those early days in the one small factory up in Wick. The success of each generation of paperweights has been relentless. It's meant that more and more manufacturing space has had to be found to satisfy the growing demand. In 1992, new factories and visitors' centres were opened in both Oban and Wick. And 1994 is a very special date, marking the silver jubilee of that very first set of Caithness paperweights. As in all industries, the years have brought more mechanization, new processes and techniques. But there's no machine anywhere that can make the objects that are being created here. In this case, there's no substitute for the artistic skills of the designers and the makers. Here's Franco Toffolo, for example, making a horse in clear glass. Colin Terrace is in no doubt as to the primary ingredient in the company's success.
The secret of this whole operation is people. We have a lot of things going for us. We have a young workforce who do not think as the old twinkling-eyed craftsmen used to do. They kept everything to themselves, they wouldn't pass anything on. In the old days, you would say to somebody, right, I want to try this, I want to get this effect, and they would say, no, can't be done. We don't have that attitude. Our glassmakers don't have that attitude because they've got such a great tradition now, 25 years of all these fantastic effects behind them.
So what actually goes on here? How do these people make such desirable objects? What are the elements and processes involved? The raw materials represent an international mix. Sand from Scotland, colours from Germany, sodium nitrate from South America, sodium carbonate from Europe. In an ordinary working day, the makers will take something like 1,000 kilos of glass from the pots in the furnaces. It's the job of the duty furnaceman to make sure that there's always enough to meet their needs. When they've all gone home, he starts his night's work. First of all, he has to turn up the furnaces, ready to melt the next batch of raw materials. It takes about 2 hours for the furnace to reach 1400 degrees centigrade. That's the temperature that's needed to make sure that the melt is effective. 2 hours later, it's topped up again, and the melting continues into the night. By 4:30 a.m., the pots have all been topped up, and the furnaces now have to be turned down to cool slowly. By the time the glassmakers arrive, the molten glass will be between 1150 and 1190 degrees. The glass which the makers work with must be free of all impurities. Fragments of clay or dirt could ruin a whole batch, and so the pots which contain it mustn't crack or crumble. They're handmade out of special clay, which is formulated to withstand up to 1500 degrees. Heating, firing and setting a new pot needs precise skills and an ability to work in up to 1100 degrees of radiant heat. And in the end, all the care and all the preparations are designed to complement the skill of the makers. They're creating swirls, patterns and combinations that they won't actually see until the following day, when the weights have cooled off. To the untrained eye, the orange and black blob on the end of their blowing iron looks like just that. But it could be anything from the most complex of limited editions to the simplest design. It's the precision and artistry of the makers that controls its gradual evolution. The various stages of the process combine to produce complexity, but they're easy enough to recognize. Basically, each weight is built up of a series of layers. Before starting, production needs are translated into measured amounts of colored glass chips, powders, rods, and all the other substances which will be used for that day's batch of paperweights. Everything's now ready for the first gather of glass. The gather has to be accurate. If it's too fast, bubbles may form. If it's too slow, the heat will be unbearable. With exactly the right amount of glass gathered, it's next palleted into shape. Depending on the design, colors or other layers are picked up and taken to what's called the glory hole to be melted into the original gather. Another gather surrounds the first with a sort of envelope of clear glass. The weights then blocked and smoothed, and finally separated from the iron, ready to be sent to the annealing kiln, where it'll be cooled down over a period of some 14 hours. Weights with a regular pattern of bubbles like this seem to provoke most questions. The way they're made again shows what an accommodating material molten glass actually is. The inside wall of this mould has a raised regular pattern on it. By lowering a gather into it, the glass has lots of little hollows forced into it. When the next gather is taken, these hollows don't get filled, but simply remain as bubbles. It looks simple enough, but if the temperature isn't right, pieces of glass can stick to the mould. That means taking it apart and laboriously chipping it all off. Once again, success depends on the skill of the maker. There are 10 grades, and it takes some 7 or 8 years to get to level 10. But whatever level they're at, they're making one of the Caithness designs. The number of weights produced in the course of a day by any individual can be affected by many things, but it's mainly dependent on his or her skill and just how difficult the design is. With some of the less complicated examples, makers can produce well over 80. But when it comes to the limited editions, the processes involved are much more time-consuming, and the discard rate is much higher. After her visit to the Perth Glasshouse, Ursula Schiefer, the secretary of the Swiss Collectors Club, wrote that the hall where the makers work was a hell-like birthplace for heavenly creations. It's an apt description, with 4 furnaces, each carrying molten glass held at a temperature around 1190 degrees centigrade. White heat, threads of molten glass, noise, sweat, busyness, all of these make up the inferno that's needed to produce the cool beauty of the typical Caithness paperweight. So, what's it like working here?
Hot most days, but you do get used to it to a certain extent, although you'll always sweat. It's not glamorous.
The sound's not too bad. The noise and that, like, it's just the heat. It is just the heat. That's 9 years I've been here and I'm still sweating yet.
Hot. It's nothing else you can say about it, it's hot. Well, I'm not one of the best of people for taking up the heat anyway. I like to stay in the shade.
I have the best seat in the factory, although in the winter time I freeze to death. The big doors open at the bottom for air for everyone else, and I get the icy blast in. So I'm toasting at one side and freezing on the other.
You can't walk up the factory in a straight line. You've got to dodge irons. People coming out of glory holes. It's very hot glass.
And if it does get too bad, all you've got to do is lift your eyes and look out the window and you see somebody watching and you're fascinated, and it makes it worthwhile watching their faces.
The new weights come out twice a year, and then you get trained up on them.
I can still remember the first time I saw a paperweight being made. You know, I was just entranced by it, because it's so different from anything else.
We've got the glass exhibition every year, and we put our own designs in. And this year, one of my designs actually went through. It's great to have a paperweight that everybody's going to buy that's got your name on it.
The swirls and bubbles of the modern designs are very different from the miniature worlds inside the more traditional ones. Creating these tiny objects in precise patterns needs special techniques that are part of glassmaking history. These tiny stars and flowers, for example, are small slices cut from sticks of glass known as millefiori rods. The rods are like sticks of rock with a consistent pattern through their entire length. The way they're made is an excellent demonstration of how glassmakers use the wonderful properties of molten glass. All they need are these 2 molds and lots of skill. The first gather is cobalt blue glass. It's lowered into the daisy mold. It's then cooled, and a gather of white is taken to enclose the daisy shape. Next comes another gather, this time of clear glass. The next gather is white glass again, but this time it's rolled in ruby glass chips. When the layer is thick enough, it's all lowered into the other star-shaped mould. It's cooled again and surrounded with a final gather of clear glass. At this point, it has the form of a thick cylinder of molten glass some 5 inches long. Meanwhile, another glassmaker has been preparing a flat disc of glass. One end of the cylinder is dropped onto it, and the two makers then draw the cylinder into a thin rod between 40 and 50 feet long. It's laid on the floor, broken off at each end, and finally cut into manageable lengths. And this is what they eventually become. Small cross-sections of the rods are laid in a mould, picked up on the end of a gather of clear or coloured glass, dependent upon the design, and then covered with another gather which is blocked into shape. The miniature glass sculptures inside these weights are the result of another traditional technique called lamp working. It involves heating and shaping rods and filaments of glass. In this case, the flat rods will become the petals of a flower. First, the petal shape is created, leaving excess glass at each end of it. One end is then heated and pulled off. Thin lines of colour are added to provide the detail in the petal design. The centre of the flower itself is set on a rod, and the petals are added one by one. As before, the final petal shape is created by pulling away the excess glass. The butterflies and leaves of this design are created using the same technique. They're then placed upside down on separate plates and taken into the glasshouse. There, a sleeve is placed over them to form an enclosed mould. Glass is gathered and lowered into the mould to pick up first the flower. This is heated in the glory hole, and another thin layer of clear glass is added to provide a space between the flower and the butterfly which will hover above it. The iron is marked to make sure that the design is correctly orientated, and the butterfly is picked up melted in and then enclosed in a final gather of glass. And this is the result. These particular examples are the work of the husband and wife team of William and Joyce Manson. Willie was actually trained by Paul Izard. He creates the animals and other internal features at home and brings them into the Perth factory to make them up into objects that carry his initials and his very special style. Whatever style of weight is being made, they all have to be cooled very gradually in a controlled environment to prevent cracking or distortions. This happens in the annealing kilns. It's the process that turns the orange and black blob into something that looks more like the paperweights we know. But before it can leave the factory, there's still more work to be done on it. Some types need faceting. all have their bases ground on a diamond wheel. Are polished, cleaned and inspected to make sure they pass the stringent quality controls. If they don't pass muster, nothing's left to chance. Caithness glass are too proud of their reputation to risk letting any flawed weights find their way out of the factory. So the limited edition rejects are comprehensively destroyed by having molten glass straight from the furnace poured over them. And from all the heat, the noise, the bustle, come objects like this. Since 1969, over 1,000 different paperweight designs have been issued by Caithness glass. Where do all the ideas come from?
A word, a random effect, finding a piece of metal or something that I know is going to give an interesting effect if you stick it through colour into glass. Sometimes I'm a very non-disciplined person, but sometimes I give myself the exercise of picking a lovely name and I physically sit down and try to design a weight to this name.
Well, usually I'll go and work in the glass house myself and thrash around a few ideas. I might be considering one particular technique that I want to play around with, and I'll make a series of different paperweights using that technique and change the colour, just varying the technique a little bit each time. So at the end of the day, I'll have maybe a dozen paperweights, all slightly different, or sometimes radically different, because halfway down that process you might see something that's really quite exciting and you want to pursue that more.
I start maybe with an idea, put it down on paper, discuss with maybe Franco or some of the glass people to find out what colours are actually available, and then experiment with how one colour maybe looks on top of another to get a third maybe completely different colour.
I suppose it's not the sort of job you can sit down and think, today I'm going to design 5 paperweights, because some days your mind is just a blank, and then these days you would maybe go and facet some paperweights or do some one-offs or do something totally different doesn't really involve you sort of coming up with new ideas. I mean, there are boundaries it's working within it, that you do try and stretch them, but invariably if you stretch them too far, you'll end up with a disastrous blob, or else you do discover a new technique.
The disastrous blob syndrome is a fairly rare experience, but all the designers acknowledge the role played by chance.
Some of the best things we've ever done were absolutely happy accidents. The trick is to remember them. Write down how the happy accident occurred the minute it does.
I'm constantly surprised by the results we get with experimenting with colour, etc. Franco was experimenting himself recently by putting our Kingfisher glass on top of gold, flammed it up with a beautiful, rich emerald green piece of glass, which I can't wait to get working on.
I once got an idea for a paperweight from a dogwood tree blossom in the States. I was actually asked to produce this as a paperweight design. So I thought about it and I thought it might be possible to make a tool to produce the petals of the flower and do it that way rather than lamp work, which is a different sort of technique. But it wasn't successful. I tried it and it didn't work. The shape of the petals turned out to be like a sail instead of sitting flat. But that gave me another idea, that it looked like a sail. Well, why don't we make a boat?
When a design has been shown to be repeatable and approved by all those involved, a precise set of specifications are written. This means breaking the design down into elements, stages, colours, and recording what has to be done step by step. The first ever unlimited edition weight was Moonflower. It's a good example of how the making process relies on layering, adding elements one over the other. It starts with a gather of coloured glass, which is centred on the iron and pressed flat until it's formed a disc. Scissors are then used to snip around the edge. This gives a petally effect and obviously leaves gaps around the edge. The middle's pulled out and snipped again. Enamel is sprinkled on the surface. In this case, it's blue on top of the heather-coloured original gather. The design that's now been formed is cooled, then plunged into clear glass. This gather traps and holds it. The next high-tech operation involves a 6-inch nail. This is pushed into the weight at 4 points: north, south, east, and west. When these depressions are cooled and plunged once more into clear glass, the glass doesn't flow into them, and so they're left as 4 large bubbles. All that now remains is for the weight to be blocked, smoothed, and cut from the iron, ready for the annealing kiln. Moonflower has proved to be one of the most popular and most enduring of all the Caithness designs. There have been some that have been less happy experiences.
We did one particular paperweight which had a hollow bubble in it. We managed the first 10 or 12 times to put a piece of charcoal inside this bubble so that the charcoal flared and gave a lovely matte finish inside the bubble, so we had a completely matte black bubble, which is super to look at. We called the weight Intruder, we launched it, and for the next 2 or 3 months we spent every day trying to make the black bubble, and it just didn't work. We got transparent blacks, we got greys, we got half black, quarter black. It was a nightmare. And needless to say, it was the best-selling weight of the collection.
So, what does Colin do for relaxation, for a rest from the demands of thinking up new ideas in glass? He comes up with items like this. It's the Caithness Turbo GTI Grand Prix Super. And this is Millefiori Man. They're made up of bits and pieces from around the glasshouse, which he's polished and put together into these weird and wonderful constructions. They're not on the catalogues, but they demonstrate how, even when he's taking some time off, Colin Tillis still can't resist the fascination of the materials of his art. There's no doubt that over the past quarter of a century, the main story of Caithness glass has been one of success. This double magnum has been designed by Colin to celebrate this unique silver jubilee. It's called Jubilee 94. And not surprisingly, is in a limited edition of only 25, one for each of the years that have produced some of the most beautiful objects to have come out of Scotland's glassmakers. The problem with anniversaries is that they tend to imply the end of a sequence. In the case of Caithness glass paperweights, that couldn't be further from the truth. 1994 is simply the transition point to the next set of developments. At the moment, for example, Colin is working on tests of his latest design, which will celebrate another 25-year anniversary, that of the first moon landing. Time doesn't stop. Everything in life is in a state of flux, each of its strands made up of sequences of moments, chasing one another away. Waves break. Branches and grasses wave in the wind. Plants grow. Perhaps one of the attractions of the works of art produced by the designers and makers of Caithness glass is that somehow they seem to catch the instantaneous, trap a transitional moment and suspend it, but in such a way that it still expresses the movement, the blending and mixing of things, the ongoing processes of living. It's a bewildering correspondence of the static and the dynamic. These are no longer simply things that stop paper blowing about. They're dreams caught in crystal.